All right, so now we begin section 11, part 2, which is the remainder of the evolution of journalism lecture. So we ended with civic journalism, and as I record this, the Board of Aldermen meeting has finished, and I'll tell you more about the assignment for tomorrow, um, or rather, I will tell you more about it at tomorrow's class. Um, and so I'll give you the links to where you can find everything and give you questions to answer and stuff like that. So be looking for that on Wednesday. Also, we will have a current events quiz on Wednesday, so make sure that you're visiting websites and all that and staying up to date on what some of the big stories are, both nationally and locally. Um, so let's get started. Beyond civic journalism, there's also citizen journalism, which is the newest form of journalism. And it's a result of new technologies like cell phones, mobile devices, and how almost every citizen now becomes a part of a story. They become news reporters in some way. If you think about going back to when we had the alleged school shooter on campus. Some of the first pictures I got of him being led out of the building with police officers was from a student that had taken the photos, and they went viral, and a friend in Colorado had received those, and he texted them to me before anybody had any kind of information. Think about other things that you catch on someone's cell phone. Uh, that is what citizen journalism is. It's when, because of this new technology, uh, when everyday citizens become part of capturing the story and disseminating the information. This kind of new creation here is not surprising. If you look at whenever a technology kind of emerges, or there's some kind of evolution in technology or change, massive change in technology, usually you see journalism change somewhat. If you think about it, I have some examples down here where, we used to have, town crier would give out leaflets of information, but it's usually, you know, only so often that they would do that. It certainly wasn't a continuous kind of everyday thing. And part of that was because it was so expensive to have pen and paper and to try to mass produce something. Because you literally had to sit there and kind of rewrite it every time. There was no copier or anything. And so, but we look at how things change over time. When you start learning how to mass produce pulp paper, that's when we start to see newspapers take off. And not only that, but a system of a press. And I mean the actual machine, the press, where you could feed pulp paper in and then stamp the news on it, and then move on and stamp a second copy and move on and stamp a third copy. And so now you can start having, because you had mass production of pulp paper, you could have wide, continuous dissemination of information. Uh, when we went from a regular, traditional old press where you actually had to set, uh, letters and numbers and things in to the press, and maybe I can show you some pictures of what that old press used to look like. You've probably seen photos of it yourself, but when we move to something that is an offset press, when we move to something where you can design something on a computer, um, then you start seeing other things being brought in, like photojournalism. So you can now start copying photos onto things. When we had laser printers come about in the 80s, you started seeing these things called zines, which were kind of like community leaflets, community little papers. So it's kind of similar to what the town crier was doing, except now you could produce these things out of your home because you could buy a laser printer and print everything up like that. And so when the internet comes out, we have blogs. There's this rise in people using blogs to disseminate information. So with citizen journalism, now we see that because of cell phone technologies, mobile cameras, things like that, everyone you have a computer in your pocket, wherever you go with your phone. And so that changes journalism as well. So it's no surprise that this has come about. And whatever the next big technological shift we encounter, whatever new technology for communicating comes out, journalism will change again. So if we think about a blog, because that's really a huge thing that we deal with today, and it kind of goes back to what I was saying previously about what is journalism and who is a journalist. When we see the rise of blogs, we start seeing people who typically weren't journalists now starting to play a journalist role. And we have this debate all the time in journalism, especially among journalism educators, trying to ask again that question of who is a journalist, what defines a journalist. So if we just talk about blogging in general, it's quite obvious. A blog is just short for a web log. Okay, it's a website where information is updated frequently and presented into reverse chronological order. So the newest stuff is usually on top. And each post contains one or several hyperlinks to other websites and stories. So that's also one of the benefits of a blog and an interactive or an internet-based journalism, is that when you quote a source or you cite something, in the old days we just had to take it as fact that the news reporter was accurately quoting something or citing something. Today we can actually link to the other stories. So if there is an interview that a reporter does with someone, you can actually have the video online. You can actually refer to old things that they said that are online. So that makes the journalism and the credibility a little deeper, and that's a good thing. PETAS.com is the first do-it-yourself blogging software that came out, and perhaps the most popular or famous company that was doing something with blogging online was Blogger.com. And so that had become the most popular do-it-yourself blogging software. It got so big that in fact Google purchased it, and you can still see little blogger icons after stories here and there. We'll probably take a look at some of those too. So the popularity of blogging really kind of takes off and becomes this huge thing around 9/11, right? So I mean, if you think when we had in 2001, we have these terrorist attacks, the internet had been out for a while, right, and had been gaining popularity among consumers, regular consumers, but using it as really a news source wasn't a huge thing at that point. You had some people that are out there that were well known for blogging, but it wasn't until 9/11 where you start seeing all these different people getting into it, and the work of blogging really became huge, right? And the reason why that was is because people wanted immediate access to a human part of the story. They wanted to vent their anger over what had happened. I mean, think about Facebook or Twitter or things right now where people just vent. Well, blogs gave people the ability to reply and vent. So it was a medium where the audience could actually talk back. People also wanted immediate access to a human part of the story because the journalists, newspapers and broadcasts and everything else, they were trying to stay conservative on the message, and I don't mean politically, I mean that they were not quick to release any information. And that's because everything was so sensitive and we were still trying to figure out what these attacks were really about. We didn't know who in the building was really alive, who was dead. And so journalists, rightfully so, kind of stayed back on the stories they were getting until they knew they had them cold. In reporting, there's a term, do you have it cold, which means do you know it absolutely? Is there any, there's no question as to what you're reporting. People didn't want sterile, cold reporting at that point. They wanted to express themselves. They were hurt. They were angry. They wanted to know details, right? So we see this kind of big response in blogging at that time. There's no real exact count of how many blogs were out there at any one time. There's an older figure that this site Technorati tried to determine and count and come up with a formula. And at one point they had said there were 160 million blogs out there on the internet, but what you need to know about that is how many times have you started to write in a diary or journal something and then you just gave up on it. There's tons of blogs that are out there that have not been updated in years. Still, if we were looking at Blogger, when Blogger was the most popular type of software that was being used, 12.4% of those sites were news related. And by far that was the most popular single category of Blogger users. So we saw that a lot of people were going to blog because they wanted to report on things. They wanted to make news. What does blogging give us? Well, it gives us personality. It's kind of like this, what we were talking about with new journalism, how you had this revolt against traditional bland reporting. People wanted more personality. Well, blogging could afford you that, right? People with small blogging operations, it wasn't ABC, it wasn't NBC, it wasn't CBS. It wasn't people that necessarily had to be trained as a traditional journalist and had to worry about their credibility. You could go on a blog and say something wrong and then clarify yourself later. And there was little blowback or threat if that happened. Whereas if you were on the ABC Nightly News and you reported something that was inaccurate or wrong, it's more than likely you'd be fired. Blogging also gives us eyewitness testimony, so we can learn about things, and this is much like citizen journalism. We can learn of things and hear about things from people that were actually there, and that just by circumstance they happened to be there when it occurred. And so those people can get online and tell us those stories. It can also give you news stories that haven't been covered by the mainstream yet. And of course, usually this is because the mainstream is waiting until they have the story cold, until they know that they're accurately reporting on something. If there's rumor or gossip, then traditional news sources are going to hold off until they have some kind of confirmation. But like we said, bloggers can kind of pull the trigger quicker. And so if we think about big stories in the past like Monica Lewinsky, Bill Clinton, that came about largely through blog reports, and in particular from this website called the Drudge Report. And we'll watch some of that, some of the leader of that organization, Matt Drudge, talking about in the first days of the Lewinsky affair, things coming out. WikiLeaks. So, you know, ABC, NBC, CBS may not want to start a story talking about the government doing things illegally or unethically. But WikiLeaks is in the business of taking things that are supposed to be secrets and releasing them. And so with a blog, you get news stories like that. So how does this impact traditional news? Well, at its peak, 40% of adults subscribe to a newspaper. It's down to about 10% now, right? So the impact of blogs and online news and things like that, news aggregators, and we'll talk about all the difference between these things. The impact of that is that now subscription to a print newspaper is down dramatically to 10%. The highest rated source for TV news is Fox News, which attracts 1.8 million viewers per day. Well, what does that have to do with blogging? Well, I would argue that the popularity of opinion-based news is partially what has made channels like Fox News, MSNBC more popular. Even CNN, if you look, at what plays every night between Anderson Cooper and Don Lemon's show, a lot of that is opinion kind of based. I mean, it wraps itself, or tries to wrap itself, around hard news, but there's a lot of commentators and critics and analysts and things that come on. It's not necessarily just recanting the facts. It's also adding stuff in. Fox seems to be doing the best of that at the moment. In 2010, there was a study conducted by the Pew Project for Excellence in Journalism. And so, although this is an older source, an older study, I think it kind of shows you the trend of what's happening here. 34% of the respondents in this study said that they read news online within the past 24 hours, as opposed to 31% who favored newspapers. So if someone came up to you and asked, in the last 24 hours, how have you gotten your news? More people, by a slight margin at that point, but this is 2010, remember. 34% of people said they were getting it within the past 24 hours. In other words, daily news. Where are you getting your daily news? 34% say they get it online, as opposed to 31% in newspapers. 41% of the people that were asked said that they got most of their news online, so the majority of their news coming online. That was 10% more than those who said they got most of their news from a newspaper. So again, it kind of breaks down. There's 31% that's getting it from a newspaper, but there's 41% that say they get most of their news online. And in the demographic of 18 to 29-year-olds, 65% said the internet was their main news source. So what all this is saying is that journalism has evolved with technology. And that also means that the delivery system of news has changed. So how people get their news has completely changed from how your grandparents got the news, right? And so we see journalism change, and a lot of that is based on technology, and it will continue to evolve and change. So that was just a quick rundown. It won't be a very long kind of session. I know everybody's quick to want to get to spring break, so but we will have a current events quiz. We'll also have I'll go over the assignment for the Alderman meeting. That's participation points that you can get, and I'll probably have that due. It won't be anything very huge. I mean, if I have you write anything, it probably won't be over 2 pages, and that'll be due probably at the end of Friday, so you can get that off of your chest and your to-do list before you start on your spring break. All right, so looking forward to seeing everybody in class on Wednesday. So we will see you then.